Missiles in the air over 6 countries in a single night. Oil jumping almost 10% in a single trading session. A blockade back in effect on Iranian ports. If you have not been following this closely over the last week, you're going to want to sit down for this one because what started as a fragile ceasefire has completely come apart. And right now, tonight, this is one of the most dangerous stretches of the entire conflict. Hey everyone, thank you so much for clicking this one, and welcome back. For those of you who are new here, I spend my time digging through military reporting, open source footage, and verified statements from official channels so I can break down exactly what is happening in conflicts like this one, cut through the noise, and give you something you can actually trust. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I have inside information from the Pentagon or from Tehran. I do not. Nobody outside a very small circle does. What I can do is walk you through everything that has been confirmed by multiple credible sources, flag anything that is still unverified so you know the difference, and give you my honest read on where this is heading. So let us get into it. First, a quick reset, because a lot of you are jumping in mid-story and the last few weeks have moved fast. This war between the United States and Iran, alongside Israel's operations against Iran and its allies, has been running since late February. Early on, there was a full blockade, a brutal exchange of strikes, and eventually a 2-week ceasefire that began back in April. That ceasefire was shaky from the start. It came under strain when Israel hit targets in Lebanon, and Iran refused to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Talks in Islamabad in mid-April fell apart. The United States reimposed a naval blockade, and things stayed tense through the spring. Then in mid-June, there was a real breakthrough. A 14-point memorandum was announced on June 14th to end the war, and it was formally signed on June 17th, with President Trump signing at the Palace of Versailles and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signing in Tehran. The blockade was lifted the next day. For a few weeks, it actually looked like this thing might hold. Shipping picked back up through the strait. Oil prices eased. There was genuine hope. That hope did not last. On July 6th, Iran's Revolutionary Guard struck 3 commercial vessels off the coast of Oman, including a Qatari liquefied natural gas tanker, and accused those ships of trying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz without Iranian permission. This is the core dispute running underneath almost everything you're about to hear. Iran's reading of the June memorandum is that it has the authority to manage and control traffic through the strait. The United States and its allies do not accept that reading. That gap in interpretation is what blew the ceasefire apart. The day after that, on July 7th, the United States carried out strikes on Iranian military targets, and Iran responded with missile and drone attacks on the Gulf bases where American forces are stationed. On July 10th, President Trump formally notified Congress that fighting had resumed, invoking his authority to keep American forces engaged. By July 12th, Central Command, which everyone in this space just calls CENTCOM, had completed a 3rd consecutive night of strikes, hitting somewhere around 140 military targets in a single wave, and more than 300 targets total across those 3 nights combined. Reported targets included missile and drone launch sites, naval assets, and ammunition storage facilities. Iranian state media said 1 army officer was killed in that round, though independent confirmation of the full casualty picture from strikes like this is almost always incomplete in the first days, and I want to be straight with you about that instead of pretending we have a clean number. Iran's response to that round was, by multiple accounts, the widest volley of the renewed conflict so far. On the night of July 12th into the 13th, missiles and drones went out towards 6 different countries in the space of a few hours. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and Jordan all reported attacks. The Revolutionary Guard claimed it hit a United States radar site in Kuwait, along with a command and control center and drone hangars at an American base in Jordan. Jordanian officials said 3 Iranian missiles fell inside their territory without causing casualties. Kuwait confirmed that 3 of its border posts and an offshore oil platform took damage, with 1 worker wounded. Bahrain, which hosts the United States Navy's 5th Fleet, sounded missile alert sirens for the 3rd time that week. The Emirates said its air defense systems engaged missiles and drones, though it later clarified the threats were intercepted outside its borders. Oman formally protested drone attacks on its Musandam and Al-Wasta regions. It also helps to remember that none of this animosity started this year. Tension between the United States and Iran goes back decades, through the 1979 revolution and hostage crisis, through the long-running dispute over Iran's nuclear program, through the 2015 nuclear deal that was later abandoned, and through years of proxy conflicts fought across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, rather than directly between Washington and Tehran. What makes this year different is that the conflict stopped being fought only through proxies and sanctions, and became a direct, open exchange of strikes between the 2 countries themselves, which is a genuinely rare and serious escalation in the context of that whole decades-long relationship. I mention that only so you have the full picture, not to relitigate the politics of how we got here, because reasonable people disagree sharply on who bears more responsibility for that history. And that debate is not really what this breakdown is for. Now here's where the picture gets more serious, and this is where I want to slow down and be precise, because precision matters when people's safety is genuinely on the line. On July 13th, Iran said its forces struck and disabled 2 vessels it called rogue supertankers. Around the same time, the United Arab Emirates reported that Iranian missiles hit 2 Emirati-flagged oil tankers inside Omani territorial waters in the Strait of Hormuz, and that 1 crew member was killed. That is, as of this recording, one of the clearest confirmed civilian and commercial casualties tied directly to this latest flare-up. And it is worth sitting with for a second, because behind every one of these strikes on shipping, there are real merchant sailors doing a dangerous job in the middle of a war zone that is not theirs. In direct response, the United States military announced it was reimposing its naval blockade on ships moving to and from Iranian ports, effective the evening of July 14th. This is the same tool Washington used earlier in the conflict, between roughly April and June, and it stretched enforcement operations all the way from the Middle East out to the Indian Ocean. Oil markets reacted immediately and sharply. Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, surged more than 9.5% in a single session, settling around $83 a barrel, its biggest one-day percentage gain in over 6 years. The American benchmark, West Texas Intermediate, jumped roughly 9.5% as well. To put that in context, prices are still well below the peaks this war produced earlier in the year, when Brent briefly pushed past $110 a barrel, but the direction of travel right now is straight back up. And shipping data from the tracking firm Kepler shows crossings through the Strait of Hormuz falling by more than 50% in the week, spanning July 10th through 12th alone, with vessels shifting toward what analysts are calling more defensive routing, avoiding the internationally recommended corridors in favor of routes closer to Iranian waters, or simply going dark on tracking systems altogether. On the night of July 13th into the 14th, CENTCOM launched yet another wave of strikes, this one aimed specifically at what officials described as degrading Iran's ability to keep attacking commercial shipping in the Strait. Iranian state and semi-official media reported strikes in or near Abadan, home to the oldest oil refinery in the Middle East, along with the port city of Mashhar, Keshem Island, and Kish Island. On Kish Island specifically, Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reported that a power plant was damaged after what the local power company described as a projectile exploding nearby during a strike, with some power generation units expected to be taken offline for repair. Kish is mostly known to outsiders as an Iranian resort island, but it also hosts military infrastructure, including naval and radar installations and aviation facilities tied to Iran's missile and drone programs, which is presumably why it has come up as a target. Iran did not sit on its hands after that round either. On July 14th, the Revolutionary Guard claimed further retaliatory strikes on Oman, saying it destroyed long-range aerial radar and vessel detection radar systems there. It also claimed missile and drone attacks on American-related installations in Jufair, Bahrain, which prompted the Bahraini Ministry of Interior to sound sirens again and urge the public to stay calm and move to safe locations. Jordan's military said it intercepted and shot down 4 missiles that entered its airspace from Iranian territory, and separately the Revolutionary Guard said it targeted a United States surface-to-surface missile base in Kuwait, claiming it set fire to 2 HIMARS launchers along with missile storage warehouses. HIMARS, for anyone who has not run across the term, stands for High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. It is a mobile American rocket launcher platform, and if that claim is accurate, losing units like that would represent a real tactical hit. Though I want to flag clearly that this specific damage claim is coming from Iranian sources and has not been independently confirmed by CENTCOM as of this recording. That distinction matters. In a conflict like this, both sides have every incentive to inflate their own success and downplay their losses, so anything sourced to one side alone about the other side's capabilities gets treated here as a claim, not a fact, until there is independent verification. Before I go further, let me take a minute to actually explain some of the terms and hardware that keep coming up in this story, because I think it helps to know what you are actually looking at, instead of just hearing acronyms fly past. CENTCOM is short for United States Central Command, which is the regional military command responsible for American operations across the Middle East, and it is the body issuing most of the official American statements you see quoted in this story. The IRGC is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is Iran's primary military and paramilitary force, separate from Iran's regular army, and it has been the driving force behind almost all of Iran's retaliatory strikes in this conflict. When you hear about drone boats, those are unmanned surface vessels packed with explosives that can be steered remotely into a target, and the United States has reportedly used them against Iranian shipping in what officials are calling a first-of-its-kind engagement for this conflict. Though, as with several of these individual claims, the full details of that specific strike were still being confirmed as of this recording. Radar and vessel detection systems, the kind Iran claims to have destroyed in Oman, are exactly what they sound like. Ground-based installations that track approaching ships and aircraft, and knocking them out would reduce a country's ability to see an attack coming, which is presumably the tactical logic behind targeting them early in a strike campaign. It is also worth understanding just how much this current phase differs from the earlier stages of the war back in the spring. Back in March, during what officials called Operation Epic Fury, American bombers were flown in from bases like RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom, and strikes hit more than 90 military sites inside Iran in a single push, along with a major attack on Karg Island, which is the terminal responsible for roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. Notably, officials said at the time that Iran's broader oil infrastructure was deliberately left untouched, with Trump citing what he called reasons of decency. Defense analysts, tracking Iran's missile and drone output during that early phase, found that Iran's launch rate dropped by more than 90% from the first day of the war to later weeks, which analysts read as a sign of Iran's stockpiles being degraded faster than they could be replenished. At the same time, analysts also found little evidence of the kind of internal defections inside Iran's military that many people had assumed would be necessary for any kind of regime-level change, which tells you that however much damage has been done to Iran's hardware and infrastructure, the political structure underneath it has, at least so far, held together. I bring this up because it is useful context for judging how seriously to take the current round of strikes. This is not the first time CENTCOM has hit Iran hard, and it is not the first time Iran has answered back across the region. What makes the current moment different is that it is happening after a real, signed peace agreement broke down, rather than during open, undeclared hostilities, and that changes the diplomatic stakes considerably. On the economic side, I also want to go a little deeper than just the oil price headline, because the ripple effects here are bigger than a number on a chart. Lloyd's List Intelligence, which tracks maritime insurance and risk, has said war risk premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz are expected to climb sharply as this escalation continues, and ship owners and charter companies are already pausing decisions on whether to send tankers through the strait at all rather than eat that cost or that risk. When insurance premiums spike like that, it does not just affect the handful of ships directly hit by strikes. It makes every single voyage through that corridor more expensive, and that cost eventually gets passed down the entire supply chain, all the way to the price you pay at a gas station thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf. The International Maritime Organization has been trying to manage a phased evacuation of stranded seafarers caught in the middle of all this, more than 11,000 of them at one point earlier in the conflict, which gives you a sense of just how many ordinary people, on ordinary cargo jobs, have had their lives disrupted by a conflict that most of them have absolutely nothing to do with. On the political side, things have hardened just as fast as they have on the battlefield. Iran's deputy foreign minister, Kazem Garibabadi, said publicly that Tehran considers itself to have no remaining obligations under that 14-point June agreement, accusing Washington of having destroyed the memorandum first. President Trump, for his part, has been blunt in recent interviews, saying strikes would intensify, and specifically warning that power plants and bridges inside Iran would be targeted next if Tehran does not return to the negotiating table. He has made comments like this before during this conflict without always following through immediately, so analysts are watching closely to see whether that threat becomes reality or stays a pressure tactic. He also walked back an earlier proposal to charge a 20% fee on cargo moving through the strait, saying instead that Gulf states would be pursuing direct trade and investment deals with the United States. Back home, the war is creating real friction in Washington too. The Senate blocked the annual defense policy bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, in a 50-46 vote, with Democratic senators citing objections tied specifically to the Iran war. That is not a minor procedural note. A bill like that almost always passes with broad bipartisan support, and a 50-46 vote failing to advance it tells you how deep the divide over this conflict has become inside American politics itself. There is also a leadership dimension to all of this that is easy to miss if you are only tracking strikes and missiles. Iran's longtime supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, passed away, and he was buried in Mashhad in a funeral procession that drew large crowds of mourners loyal to the Islamic Republic. His successor and son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has now taken on the role of supreme leader, but he was notably absent from his own father's public funeral proceedings and reportedly from other public events since. Security analysts, including Mohsen Milani, have suggested this is likely a deliberate choice, given the scale of Iran's intelligence failures earlier in this war, and the real risk that any public appearance could expose the new supreme leader to an assassination attempt. Whether or not that theory is correct, it is worth knowing that Iran is managing a wartime leadership transition at the exact same moment it is trying to fight a multi-front conflict, and that combination alone tends to make any state's decision-making less predictable, not more. So let me try to answer the question I think most of you actually came here for. Why does any of this matter beyond the region, and why does the Strait of Hormuz specifically keep coming up over and over again in this story? The strait is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, and before this war began, something like 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas exports passed through it on tankers every single day. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most important choke points in the global economy. When Iran threatens to close it, or when attacks make shipping companies too nervous to send tankers through it, the effect shows up almost immediately at gas pumps and in energy markets worldwide, which is exactly what we are seeing right now with oil prices jumping close to 10% in a single day. Iran understands this leverage completely, which is part of why the strait keeps becoming the flashpoint every single time this conflict reheats, even when the underlying disputes are really about broader issues like the war in Lebanon, sanctions, and the terms of any lasting peace. I want to pause here for a second and be transparent about how I actually put a breakdown like this together, because I think that matters just as much as the content itself, especially with a story this serious. Everything I have walked you through so far comes from named, checkable sources, official CENTCOM statements, on-the-record comments from government officials in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the Emirates, wire reporting from outlets like Reuters and the Associated Press, and coverage from established newsrooms including Al Jazeera, CNN, Fox News, and CNBC, cross-referenced against each other rather than taken from any single outlet alone. Where a claim comes only from Iranian state media like Fars or IRNA, I'm telling you that explicitly, because those outlets report from inside a country actively at war and have their own incentives around what gets emphasized. Where a claim comes only from an anonymous American official, I'm telling you that too. And where I genuinely do not know something, like the exact scale of damage from a specific strike or the true casualty count in the first hours after an attack, I'm going to say I do not know, instead of filling that gap with a guess dressed up as a fact. That is really the whole difference between a breakdown you can trust and the kind of noise that spreads fastest online during a crisis like this one. The version of this story that gets the most attention is not always the version that is actually true. And I would rather be a little slower and a little less dramatic than be wrong about something this serious. Now, for the part some of you are here for specifically, which is trying to understand where this actually goes from here. I want to be honest with you. Nobody credible is going to tell you they know for certain. And if someone online is telling you they know exactly what happens next with total confidence, that is usually a sign to be skeptical of them, not a sign they have special insight. What I can tell you is what the informed analysts are saying. Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, has described the American strategy right now as essentially a bet that enough sustained military pressure will eventually force Iran back to serious negotiations. But he has also been clear that this is a genuine gamble, because Iran's pattern throughout this entire war has been to respond to pressure with retaliation rather than concession, not the other way around. Al Jazeera's own correspondent covering this from Tehran described the current situation in a phrase I think sums it up better than anything I could come up with myself, calling it a low-intensity war that is becoming persistent, with real concern that if it keeps escalating at this pace, it could slide into something closer to a full-scale regional war, rather than the rolling exchange of strikes we have seen for the past several months. Here's my honest take, for whatever it is worth. What strikes me most about the last week specifically is the shift in scale and reach. Earlier phases of this conflict were largely contained to direct exchanges between the United States, Israel, and Iran. What we are watching now is Iran spreading its retaliation across 6 separate countries in a single night, several of which are not direct combatants in this war at all. They simply host American military infrastructure or happen to sit along the shipping lanes Iran wants to control. That is a meaningful escalation in itself because every additional country that gets pulled into the blast radius, so to speak, is another government with its own domestic pressure, its own relationship with Washington, and its own incentive to either push for de-escalation or, in a worse scenario, to start taking more active steps to protect itself. Jordan intercepting missiles, Bahrain sounding alert sirens for the 3rd time in a week, Kuwait reporting damage to an oil platform and border posts. These are not abstract data points. These are governments now actively defending their own territory from a conflict that started as a bilateral dispute between 2 other countries. When you widen a war's footprint like that, you also widen the number of ways it can accidentally spiral beyond anyone's original intentions. And that, to me, is the single most important thing to watch going forward, more important than any individual strike or any individual claim from either side. Let me walk you through how I think about the range of outcomes from here, because I find it more useful than just saying things could go well or badly. On one end, there is a de-escalation path where the economic pain of these oil price spikes and the political pressure building inside all of these Gulf countries, plus inside the United States Senate itself, pushes both sides back towards some version of renegotiating that 14-point agreement, probably with tighter, clearer language around who actually controls traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, since that ambiguity is what broke the last deal. That path is realistic. It has already happened once this year, and both sides have shown at different points that they are capable of stepping back from the edge when the cost gets high enough. On the other end, there's a genuine escalation path, the one Trump has been explicitly threatening in public, where strikes expand into Iranian infrastructure like power plants and bridges, which would represent a serious shift from hitting military and shipping-related targets to hitting things that directly affect ordinary Iranian civilians. And that kind of shift historically makes de-escalation much harder to walk back from, not easier. In between those two extremes is probably the most likely near-term outcome, which is more of what we have already been watching for the past week. A grinding, rolling exchange where CENTCOM hits Iranian targets, Iran answers with strikes across the Gulf, oil prices stay elevated and volatile, and neither side achieves a clean, decisive win, but neither side backs down either. If I had to bet, and I want to be honest that this is genuinely a bet and not a prediction I would stake my credibility on, I would lean toward that middle scenario continuing for at least the next several weeks, simply because that is the pattern this conflict has followed every single time it has flared up so far this year. But conflicts like this do not always follow their own pattern, and the 6-country spread we saw this week is exactly the kind of development that can break a pattern rather than extend it, so I am watching that variable more closely than any other right now. I also think it is worth being honest about the human cost that tends to get buried under all this strategic analysis. Behind the strike counts and the barrel prices, there is a wounded oil platform worker in Kuwait. There is a merchant sailor killed on a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, who almost certainly had nothing to do with this war beyond doing his job on the wrong ship at the wrong time. There is an Iranian army officer confirmed dead in the strikes on military targets. There are people in Bahrain and Doha who had shrapnel and drone debris fall near them this week while going about ordinary life. Whatever your view on the politics or the strategy here, and I'm not going to try to tell you what to think about that, it is worth remembering that every one of these updates represents real risk to real people who did not choose to be in the middle of it. So where does that leave us? As of this recording, the ceasefire from June has effectively collapsed. The naval blockade is back in force. Oil prices are climbing fast. Strikes are continuing on both sides on a near-nightly basis. Iran says it has no remaining obligations under the agreement it signed just a month ago. The United States is publicly threatening to escalate further into infrastructure targets like power plants and bridges if there is no return to the table. And 6 different countries around the Gulf are now dealing with the fallout of a conflict that keeps refusing to stay contained. I will be tracking every official statement from CENTCOM, from Iranian state media, and from the governments caught in between, and I will keep bringing you the verified version of events, not the version optimized for panic or for clicks. This is a moment that genuinely deserves your attention, but it also deserves careful, sourced reporting rather than speculation dressed up as certainty, and that is what I'm going to keep giving you every time the story moves. Before you go, I want to leave you with 2 things, because both of them genuinely help me keep doing this the right way. First, if this kind of grounded, sourced breakdown is useful to you, take a second right now and hit subscribe, and make sure notifications are turned on. A story like this can shift overnight, sometimes within a single hour, and my plan is to keep putting out updates the moment there is something confirmed and worth your actual time, not before, and not just because something dramatic showed up on social media that has not been verified yet. Subscribing is the difference between hearing about the next major development from me with proper context, or hearing about it secondhand, from a screenshot with no sourcing behind it at all. Second, drop a comment below and tell me specifically what you want me to dig into next. Do you want a deeper breakdown of the military hardware involved on both sides? Do you want more on how this is actually moving oil and shipping markets, and what that means for prices where you live? Do you want the fuller diplomatic history behind this relationship, or more on the leadership transition happening inside Iran right now? I genuinely read every single comment, and it directly shapes what I choose to research and cover next. So if there is a piece of this story you feel is being underexplained anywhere else, tell me, and I will go get it verified and bring it back to you straight. Thank you for watching. And more than that, thank you for actually wanting the sourced version of a story like this instead of just the loudest version of it. I take that seriously. I will keep tracking every official statement, every confirmed strike, and every verified claim from every side of this conflict. And I will keep separating what we know for certain from what is still unconfirmed every single time I bring you an update. That is the standard I am holding myself to here, and I am not going to lower it just because a headline could get more attention with less caution behind it. Stay safe out there, stay informed, stay skeptical of anything unverified, and I will see you in the next one.